Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How you doing today, Nick?
Trying to survive this heat wave in New York. Yourself?
Oh, it's only about 105, and what's there to talk about?
Hey, not my favorite weather.
No, well, you know, we don't get these too often, so we're getting into the dog days of summer, so this is par for the course. Back in February and March when we were freezing, we were looking forward to these days, so I can't be hypocritical and curse them also, because then I'll just never be happy. But I want to, before we even get going here, thank Mary Craig one more time for her time last week, and she really, I thought, did a wonderful job, and I think the audience liked her a lot too, because she is our number one downloaded episode. So clearly Mary has a following, so maybe we need to get her back to get some of that Mary heat on the podcast in the future.
Yeah, we can definitely get more from the librarian perspective, or even just from a state like Virginia that is not aligned with the Common Core standards, and see how they, interpret some of these changes that are taking place.
I think if we just say we're having Mary on, that alone could. It's like the Colbert bump.
Yeah, yeah, very good. I can tell you she's just an incredibly dedicated educator, and really just to see the kids get off their bicycles to run up to her when those books are delivered is tremendously inspirational, and brings a tear to your eye, a good tear.
That's wonderful. So let us get into our topics for this episode. There were a couple of articles that we came across in the past few days, and they both involved social emotional learning, or SEL. So I wanted to take the New York Times article first. I believe the article was written by David Bornstein, who I'm not sure is a regular contributor to the Times, but he really did a wonderful job in shining a light on social emotional learning and how it not only impacts students and their performance in school, but also how they perform once they leave school, the hallways of the school, and move on to either higher learning or to the workplace.
Yeah, you shared the article with me, and I thought it was one of the better articles I've read in a long time about the state of education today. Because I think I've really always struggled to articulate why I get frustrated with using data in school to evaluate teachers, to evaluate students, to evaluate progress. And I felt as if this study that he comments on is a great use of data. Mm-hmm. For us to improve how we educate kids in the K-12 setting.
Now, I would love to know a whole lot more about how they actually conducted the study, because it seems like some of these numbers, and we'll go through some of them, I wonder how they quantified this information, because it seems pretty comprehensive and fairly specific. For example, one of the things that he mentions is that they gave early childhood teachers an assessment tool, which they called the Social Competence Scale. And basically they asked the teachers to identify how students are in several categories. And one of the things that they were looking at is, how they interact with other students, and how they bond with their school, how they interact with adults, looking at their social and emotional skills. And then they basically quantified that somehow, and they used that to predict the future, and they were shockingly accurate, it seems, in their results. And they concluded that, for example, a child with good social skills, however was measured in their according to their standards, was 4 times as likely to graduate college than a student without. And they went deep. I mean, they talked about graduation rates and college degrees, and whether or not a child would grow up and gain full-time employment. Would they live in public housing? Would they wind up in juvenile detention or in prison? So it really commented on both sides of the spectrum.
Well, and well, first of all, did you feel as strongly about the article as I did, or did you find some holes in the argument?
Oh. Well, I thought it was very compelling, and I thought it was very interesting how they were looking at this. I just want to know how they actually achieve the clarity in the numbers that they seem to be convinced about. Like, for example, they talk about the teachers college at Columbia University and how they were trying to determine the economic value of different social and emotional learning programs that they had indicated had strong track records. So they determined that for every dollar that they spend on these programs, it yields $11 in return, and they're just so specific. I wonder how they did that, and I think there are some links in the article that you could look into, and I guess when I have some time, I'll take a look at that. But it just something like that's so specific. I wholeheartedly buy into the large scale argument, the holistic argument. I just wonder if you could really narrow it down to the nitty gritty, because it comes back to what we've been talking about a number of times on the podcast, is that how could you take this incredible multitude of factors and boil it down to any one number? It's the same reason why, APPR doesn't work for me, and coming up with a specific letter or number grade for a teacher doesn't work, just because there's so many factors
Okay, but
involved.
that's why I thought this was such a better evaluative tool, because it was not just based on how somebody performs on a random test. This was a longitudinal study of kids and their social behaviors that have been observed in an early setting, and how that will then predict how well they will do in the future. And I think you hear from teachers so often. Look, well, I'll ask you this. Do you believe that there are students all throughout this country that no matter who their teacher is, they will do exceptionally well in school?
Without a doubt.
Right. Okay. Those top performing kids, it does not matter. And would you say that there are some students that no matter who their teacher is, the problems and obstacles in their lives, doesn't matter who a teacher is, they're going to do poorly given the system we have in place now?
Absolutely.
So I felt as if this article and the study was targeting that. Let's not think about necessarily how well they perform on a random test throughout the year. Let's talk about, because you always hear teachers say, can we really prepare kids for life after high school? And each kid, I think, needs a different skill set to be able to be successful. Let's think about kids who are incredibly shy. Don't you think we need to do a better job of trying to get them to break out of that? And then my follow-up is, are we doing a good job to get them out of that? Because in life, if you're incredibly introverted and shy, there might be some struggles and obstacles you deal with. Yet you still might perform well on a test.
Right. Actually, you're jumping the gun a little. I do want to talk about the role of SEL in the classroom and whose responsibility is it. But first, I just want to take another minute just to dissect the article a little bit more, and then by all means, let's jump into all those great questions that you were just asking. So one of the things that they mentioned in this article, and actually they mentioned in the second article as well, is an organization that I was not familiar with prior to reading these articles, and that's an organization called CASEL. And CASEL is an acronym that stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And I believe they're from the Midwest, I think Illinois, if I'm not mistaken. And they're basically an organization. They've been around for a number of years. They're funded through various foundations, and they are trying to bring this type of social and emotional learning into school districts all across the country. And so I didn't really know this organization even existed prior to these articles.
Oh, no, I didn't know about it either. And it appears that if they're doing nice work all over the country. I mean, I think it was in Alaska as well as Texas. But I haven't heard anything about it at this point.
Right. So their emphasis is really on the whole child, educating the whole child, or there are different names for social emotional learning, and that is sometimes known as character education. But all these different elements that go on beside the academics and beside the curriculum. In the first article, and that was an article that I came across in Principal Leadership, written by Crystal Taylor and Stephen Kilgus. And they break down some of the challenges faced in adolescence that they believe social emotional learning can help to tackle. For example, the emerging sense of self, peer pressure, increased at-risk behavior using sex and drugs and alcohol, higher rates of mood disorders, increased need for independence, changing social networks. I mean, these are all things that we see literally every day, multiple times a day, working in the setting that we work in, and we're working with 7 through 12 students. They also talk about, they identify 5 competency areas of SEL. And I thought this was interesting. Just a few of them. One is self awareness, identifying one's strengths and weaknesses. The other is self management, staying in control and persisting through challenges, which I think is particularly interesting and important. Another one is social awareness, being able to empathize with others and having responsibility for your decision making, making safe choices, ethical choices. So I thought that when you combine the information from both these articles, it really makes a compelling argument for the need to really promote social and emotional learning in schools. And so now I guess we can touch upon the importance of what you were getting at before. And whose role is it to implement social and emotional learning in a school building? Is it the administrator's role? Is it the teacher in the classroom? Is it the guidance counselor's role? What do you think?
I would venture to guess that if you poll teachers throughout, let's talk about elementary teachers. I bet many of them would say that they spend the bulk of the year preparing for state exams of any form, and then maybe do an assembly or two at the end of the year on character education.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is how a lot of schools claim to be reaching, or teaching some of these skills. And I think it has to be infused all throughout the school year in various programs. I think it's responsibility. I think first and foremost, it has to come from the top, because I always feel as if teachers will be more likely to follow. If programs and projects are put in place at the top, then teachers will, and teachers have to be asked to implement them and incorporate into lessons. And teachers also have to be understanding of pulling kids out when they need to be. Because what this article is really focusing on is that there are different needs that need to be met for each student. Everybody can't just have the same lesson to deal with these issues. Some kids have to work on interpersonal skills. Some kids have to work on anger management. Some kids have to work on bouts of depression. Some kids have to work on laziness. And I'm just throwing issues out there that I think all young people are being confronted with.
I agree. And what's interesting about Castle, it reminds me of something that I worked on. This is probably going back about 17, 18 years back in Brooklyn. It was called a program called Overcoming Obstacles. I don't know if I ever told you about this, but I don't even know how I wound up getting involved. They were looking for sort of young, energetic people to help them with this program. And I wound up being on the curriculum writing team. And all that basically meant was they would send me packages of material to review, and I would make some comment suggestions. I would add some ideas and send it back. And they were doing that with, I don't even know how many hundreds of other educators throughout the city. And they put together a curriculum, and they were raising millions and millions of dollars so they could bring these programs into the schools. And essentially, there were lessons that were designed to teach these very types of social and emotional skills. It was about win-lose situations, win-win situations, how to deal with conflict, and it had other life skills like how to do a resume and so on. And the idea was to implement these lessons. And in some cases, in many cases, they were standalone lessons where the activity, the aim, everything else was all designed to sort of work on this skill. And I remember actually having a flashback. They had come to videotape one of my lessons when I was doing one of the Overcoming Obstacles lessons. Every year at the end of the year, they would have a big dinner at the Marriott Marquis in the city, and they'd invite teachers to attend who were part of this program. And they'd also invite some really, really wealthy people, because they were the people who were ultimately going to give money for these programs. I remember one of the years that I went, they were honoring Robert Kraft, who was the owner of the Patriots. So it was all NFL people. Paul Tagliabue was there, and Robert Kraft was there, and all kinds of coaches and players were there. And of course, the teachers were sitting in the back, like in steerage. But it was still kind of cool to be in the room. Anyway, long story short, if that's possible. So I remember they came in to videotape my lesson because they were going to use that as part of a compilation for these types of dinners to raise more money in the future. So one of the lessons involved win-lose situations, and the lesson involved me bringing in a block of wood and a hammer and a nail. And I asked the student, who was in a bad mood or someone, come up and hammer this nail into this block of wood, and that will let out your aggressions. And he comes up and he hammers the nail into the wood, and everything's great. And I said, "Do you feel better?" He says, "Yes." So, okay, now you know what? Let's take the nail out because you feel better, and now that's all said and done. So we pry the nail out of the wood, and I said, "Okay, great." So we're back to where we were at the beginning, right? You were upset. You took out the hammer and the nail. We hammered the nail into the wood. Now the nail's out. It's like it never happened. And then I turn to the class and I hold up the wood. And of course, what do they see? And they see the hole that the nail left in the wood. And then we talk about the impact of making decisions and making rash decisions, and the impact of your actions, and the aftermath and the ramifications of your anger, and taking it out on people, et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes this life lesson, which is really perfectly aligned with what Castle's trying to do and what these articles are talking about, and talking about social and emotional learning. And I really wasn't until I looked at these articles and kind of put two and two together that I realized that this Overcoming Obstacles program really was doing this, a couple of decades ago. I'll put a link to their website up on the podcast homepage.
Yeah, I mean that's a very nice story, and then as you're telling it, my mind goes in this direction. There's still going to be kids in that larger setting who are either not going to get it, or not going to listen, or they're going to need much more follow through with the idea. And what this Bornstein article talks about is when kids get suspended. There's one section of there. What do we do when kids... Think about it. When we were in school, it was really... I think it was just out of school suspension, and that was it, or a detention. And then the concept of in-school suspensions came up because they didn't want kids to miss class time, right? Or miss, the material. So what do a lot of in-school suspension rooms consist of? Teachers just sending work down and kids doing work all period. Well, wouldn't it be a better use of time if there was some conflict resolution and follow up to lessons like what you just did in that setting with a trained professional working with these people?
Well, that would be wonderful. But now I put on my administrator hat and ask the very simple question: where are we getting the resources for that kind of program?
Well, you have to find the resources, because in the end, it's going to pay off much more than the extra help sessions that you're going to pay teachers to do for exams that are not going to make much of a difference.
Right. So now you're touching upon something that also was in the Times piece, the Bornstein article, which is restorative justice. And he mentions that. So where you sort of move away from the concept of punishment for punishment's sake, and you get into something a little bit more along the lines of what you're intimating here, is that it becomes that learning experience as opposed to simply that punitive experience.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, I wouldn't necessarily use this for very serious offenses, but for a lot of the conflicts that happen in schools all over the country, fight with a student, mostly fights with students, minor disrespect to a teacher, whether it's cheating on assignments, cheating on tests. I think this is a great tool, and that's another part of the article that stuck with me.
Okay, so on the administrative side, we could try to find resources to bring someone into an in-school suspension room and provide this type of support. Now, let's take a look at the counselor side of it. So how do counselors play a role in increasing the amount of social and emotional learning that goes on throughout the school day?
I think the guidance counselors you're referring to, right?
Yes, guidance counselors, or any clinician, social worker, right. School psychologist.
Well, I've always felt that when you look at like the national average of student to guidance counselor ratio, it's overwhelming. I mean, if you just do some basic math, they can't see kids. If
doing basic math is an overwhelming
well,
problem.
Well, really,
too.
if they have anywhere from 200 to 400 kids in their caseload. And I think on the middle school level, it's probably even worse, right?
Oh, pure middle school?
Yeah.
They could have, I don't even know, 500, 1,000 to 1.
Right. So how, I mean, on the high school level, it's probably a little bit better, but how are you...
In the city, out where we are, I don't think they would ever dream of doing something like that, but...
Right.
But
it could be.
Yeah.
How are you supposed to be able to counsel students if you don't have more of a general... contact with them, or somewhat of a regular schedule, and it's very difficult. But what
happens is you say that you're doing it, and you are in name only because you have your conflict resolution group that's going to talk about bullying or going to talk about social media or what have you, and everybody meets. So over the course of 6 months, each kid gets to spend 20 minutes with the counselor. But that's not quite, what we're talking about here in terms of a robust program.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if I would necessarily use the. I feel strongly about hiring just one extra person. And that person's job is the, call it the, what'd you say, restorative justice, conflict resolution room, whatever you want to say.
Mm.
And that person's job is to focus on the behaviors that are constantly getting kids into the ISS room and working in that field, and then that one alone. Because I think also a lot of schools would probably say that there's a certain segment, what is it, 5-10% of the school that's repeat offenders, right?
Absolutely.
So you're going to get to know them, and hopefully not as well if you do it well, if you conduct the program well, but it's going to be similar kids. The same
Well, they
type of-
mentioned that. It's funny. They talk about, if I can see if I can quickly find it in the article. They're talking to someone who was, I guess, on the team that collected data, and they talked about how every year they would bring together a group of the graduating seniors, about 300 or 400 kids, and they'd ask them to identify the problems in the school. 3 years ago, they said that number one problem was school safety. 2 years ago, it dropped to number two. Last year, it dropped to number three.
Right.
So those are the results that they're talking about. Where and that you're talking about that if you identify those kids and you can start to help shape their behavior, then you wind up having an impact on the environment and the learning environment in your building, and certainly students feel safer, and that's an incredible thing.
If we continue on this path of everything being test based, score based, data driven, just a pure numbers game. Well,
Mm-hmm.
just think about you're the child in first, second, or third grade, who doesn't perform well on a state exam. And you get disgruntled because you're constantly, because when we were in first, second, and third grade, unless your parents sat down with you, you really didn't hear about how you did on these exams.
Right, you took it, but you
took
didn't
it.
really know.
Right. So now you're this 6, 7, 8-year-old kid, and you're being told, and then what do? They make you come in for a twilight program. They give you extra. I mean, I look at the work that kids are being asked to do on vacations in first and second grade, third grade, these huge packets that they have to complete. That never existed. Now, for the kids who are doing well, that's not going to impact them. But now what happens? Well, the kids get a little bit more angry, and they get a little bit more upset with school, and they get a little bit more resentful of having to do. So now they actually are putting in less of an effort because they're starting to quit. And now those kids who were frustrated in elementary school, but still keep going on grade by grade, they now become the kids in middle school and high school who don't want to do any homework. They just give up.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And now I would argue, maybe I'm biased, but when you get to the middle and high school level, well, that's really when the homework is kind of critical to their success, because now we're trying to teach them skills that are going to hopefully help them for those that are college bound. And work ethic alone, of course, is important. But we're creating kids who are just so angry at the system, and it's counterproductive.
They mentioned that in the other article from a principal leadership article. Sometimes those students are deemed to, quote unquote, have an attitude, or that's ingrained in them already. So they're a lost cause. So we don't even look to address the social and emotional learning for those students because that's just who they are. And now we have to deal with it. And that's really harmful, especially if you identify that student as a ninth grader and you're looking to see, oh my God, we have 3.5 more years of this, then that becomes really, really dangerous. And, you want to teach these students, hopefully, social and emotional skills that will help them stay out of trouble. And also, God willing, it will help them academically and will pay dividends, in that realm. But you have to start with knowing the student and at least trying to make some headway. But at the same time, speaking as the administrator, it's sometimes difficult to get that message through from the administrative side because I'm the one who's lowering the hammer every time. I'm the one who's delivering the message, calling the home saying there's going to be a suspension, there's going to be a this, there's going to be a that, we have to have a meeting. So it makes it's not impossible, but sometimes it makes it a little more difficult on my end to be also the person who wants to kind of get to know that student, because sometimes they develop that resentment and it's directed towards me, even though the problem originated in the science classroom or originated in the gym or originated on the field. And now it's sort of just playing itself out in my office, but I'm the one who has to deliver the bad news, which is part of what I do. But I'm always trying to get to know them and try to solve or prevent future problems. And that's, I guess, maybe I don't want to change topics too drastically here, but that's part of one of the strategies that I implement. And sometimes teachers view that positively and they understand where I'm coming from, and sometimes they don't, because there is a type of person who, when they send the child to your office, they want a pound of flesh. They want like the head on a pike
But
in the hallway,
But that's a culture we have to change.
without a doubt.
Yeah, and if you make the culture one of, let's, whatever you want to call it, character development, social skills, you will see teachers respond to that. But you have to that's what I mean, from the top down. You have
Right,
to
I agree.
emphasize that over test scores.
I agree, but so where I'm coming from is when a student comes into my office, I'm not only trying to address how do we provide the proper punishment or discipline for the infraction, but more importantly, and this is what I'll say to the teacher, don't we want the student to be in a situation where this doesn't happen again? How do we prevent the repetition? So I'm trying to build towards that also. So I'm trying to walk a fine line. I want to make sure that the student's held accountable for his or her actions, because I truly believe in accountability. But at the same time, I also want to take steps in making sure that this is a one-time offense. Now, of course, it doesn't always work that way, but at least that's the goal, because I want to be able to. At the end of the day, that student is going back in 99.9% of the time. Is going back into that teacher's classroom. So how do we get that to be a positive environment for that student and for that teacher moving forward? And if it's simply just teacher sets them up for me and I just knock it down, and then we expect everything to be magically back to normal or better the next day in class, it's not realistic. So steps have to be taken, and that's part of the social emotional learning that we've been talking about.
Yeah. I'm so worried. I know I bring this up in almost every discussion, but I'm just so concerned that our elementary schools have largely become locations to hopefully get kids to a passing grade on an assessment test. And our high schools have become locations where we hopefully just get them to graduate with a diploma.
Mm-hmm.
And neither of those goals is really going to help a large segment of our kids, because there are many kids who will be able to graduate, and there are many kids who will be able to get that passing score on the assessment test in elementary school, but their needs haven't been met. And they're not really prepared socially and emotionally to handle what is out there, when they get out of school.
Right. And well, that's what Castle and
Yeah.
other groups like that who are promoting this social emotional learning or trying to advocate. In the principal leadership article, they cite a statistic that as a result of SEL, they've seen an 11 percentile point increase in learning. And so that I guess speaks to what you were alluding to as well. But it goes further, of course, and we want to make sure that we're addressing the whole child and not just the academic piece, not the curriculum piece alone, but the social and emotional piece as well.
Right. Well, it's finally a study that I enjoyed reading.
All right, good. Well, it only took 12 episodes for us to get to something that you enjoyed reading. So maybe every 12 we'll find another one. But let's move on to the Methods Lab segment of the show. And I wanted to talk about vocabulary. And this is a little bit of a touchy subject, I know, because we have some school of thought or schools of thought where people say, let students, especially on the younger grade levels, spell creatively and write creatively and not get bogged down on things like grammar or vocabulary or word usage. And then there's the other school of thought, which I'm going to guess we both fall into, where we would rather see them take care of these building blocks or address these building blocks of language. So I have a few questions that I'd like us to kind of discuss here. What are the strategies that teachers can use to help build students' vocabularies?
Well, two things off the top of my head that I know I've used. Number one, when students take any objective test, there are times where I will, this is really more for the younger grades, I will give them back the test and then ask them to take 5 minutes and underline any word in the text that they didn't know the definition of. They didn't know. And then we try to work through and see if that prevented them. Because I think a lot of times in the history and the science classes, it's not that the students do not know the material, it's that they can't read the question.
That's
Some
right.
basic
Or
vocabulary.
the choice.
Right. Exactly. Or the choices are. So that's one thing I've done, and that's been in the middle school. The kids they actually enjoy it because it does really teach them the words more in context, and it's very difficult to anticipate what words students don't know. It's different for every kid.
That's
Uh,
right.
the
And it's usually words that you can't even imagine that they didn't know.
Of course, right.
And they surprise you.
The other thing is that we utilize vocabulary books in the English classes, and there's one for each grade level. So what I have done is whatever chapter the English teacher is on in the vocab book, I will take those words and I will randomly use them in my lesson. And what I've also done is I've sent out Remind 101 text messages to students in which I've used those words as well in a history context.
That's great.
And it's funny because the first time I do it, the kids think, "Oh my God, you used the word that's in the vocabulary book. Can you believe it?" They don't realize at the beginning that I'm doing it on purpose. But I think using it, I've never been a big fan of vocab books. I do think the ones we use are very good for what they're capable of doing. But let's be honest, a lot of kids just copy the activities from each other.
Right. Right.
And I just believe you have to use the words in context. I remember once I had given an identification quiz to a group of kids and AP students, and they all, I think one of the identifications I want to say was Rosa Parks, but they all used the word galvanized in the answer, which is a great. They had no clue what the word galvanized means.
Right.
And they're all writing it on the test. She galvanized the movement. But they had no clue. So I still remember this one student, Danielle Donahue, who's extraordinarily successful speech pathologist already in graduate school. And she just emails me back while she's in college and says, "Mr. Simone, the word galvanized is everywhere. It doesn't matter what I do in college. It doesn't matter what I'm reading. It's in headlines. And to this day, she's constantly, So anyway, that's an example of utilizing if you don't use it in context, you're not going to really improve the vocabulary.
Right. I always believed in immersion, that you have to hear words. I mean, there are so many words that I've heard or I've read, and just coming across them it even if I don't know what it is, it still plants a seed. I still gain some familiarity. And maybe at some point when I hear it the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth time, I'll either start to figure it out in the context of how it's being used, or I'll actually look it up and add it to my repertoire of words that I know, and hopefully get to use it. Because if you don't utilize it, then you will eventually kind of forget the word, just like any other thing if you don't use it. So when I was teaching in class, I would try to use a bigger word and then follow it up with a synonym, so they heard the word and they heard the synonym together. So it wasn't so much that I had to wait for the word to come up. I would bring the word up, and then I would provide the context and a synonym for it, just so they got to hear it. They were immersed in vocabulary, and that was in addition to, I used to create word walls, and even for older kids, because I believe that really works. That if you pull a word out of the context that in which you're using it, it's a document that you're reading, what have you, and you pull out that word because the students don't know it and it goes up on a wall, it's a reminder that that's a word that's important. That's a word that we've used, and they will see it and hopefully plants the seed. And every now and then I would give them a quiz on those words just to help boost their average. But they learned it in context. I tested it in isolation and not vice versa. So I felt like it was more organic how they came across the word, and then I would still assess their recall of the word later on because I wanted it to stick and I wanted to make sure that they were getting it. And it was a great opportunity also for kids to boost their averages because they just had to show that they were familiar with the words that we were using in class, and they could earn points. So I just feel vocabulary is so important, and it almost more than anything other than maybe your outward appearance. Like if you show up to an interview completely disheveled versus, you know, maintained and dressed nicely. Um, it's like that dividing line that separates the person who is in all likelihood a comes across as a better candidate for a job than someone who doesn't. And it has everything to do with how you express yourself and the words that you're using, the words that you're capable of using, the words that you understand other people using. You present yourself in such a different way, and I feel like it's a great divider. It's a separator. It's one of those things that you can really point to and say, you know what, that person. Both people might be equally intelligent, but that person presents himself or herself as being more intelligent than the other, just on a surface glance.
And not only being able to articulate yourself on that way, on that level, but be able to understand people. I mean, everybody can't write and speak at the highest of levels, but you can still understand people
Right.
on that level. And I think that's what I try to achieve with my students. Is that you're all not going to be able to write like Maureen Dowd. I can't write like Maureen Dowd, but I can understand her usually.
Yes. This would be a good time to let our listeners in on a little inside joke there with Maureen Dowd. Years ago, when we first started working with each other, we used to read Dowd pretty religiously, and I would say every column or two there was a word. I'll speak for myself. I don't speak for you. That not only did I not know the definition, that I had never seen before in
Right.
my life. And I remember we used to have little post-it notes and put them up by our workspace, which was right next to, kind of adjacent to one another. And we used to have these words. I know it's complete nerdville, but that's okay.
Yeah.
We used to have these words up there, and they were words that I had just never known existed. And so she's the pinnacle
Oh,
for me.
no question.
She's I guess perhaps if we were born a decade or two earlier, our guy would have been William Sapphire, but instead for our generation, it's Maureen Dowd.
Yes, I totally agree.
But anyway, so let me kind of close this segment by asking you a really simple question: do you keep a dictionary in class?
Is this podcast from 1990 or?
No, no, no. It's not. It's not.
I used to, but now we just use dictionary.com. Do you want
Okay.
me to keep a dictionary in class?
No, not necessarily. But this is a perfect example of it's not a horrendous idea. It's not horrific, only because there is something about looking through a dictionary. It's not a perfect replacement to use dictionary.com as opposed to using a dictionary. Yes, the speed of dictionary.com is wonderful, but there's something about going through a dictionary. You come upon other words when you go through a dictionary. With dictionary.com, you don't. You get only the word that you're searching for. And sometimes it goes back to that immersion theory that I had before. So how many times when you used to look through a dictionary did you stop and catch another word while searching for the word that you were looking for?
A very fair point, but it
So
takes so much longer.
I know. It's a first world problem. It has to go to space. That's Louis C.K. But not that I'm saying we throw out the phones and only use dictionaries, but there's nothing. I don't find anything wrong with it, and just the fact that it's there and that it's used, even whether you use it or I used to have a different student each day who was on dictionary patrol, and they would keep it on their desk, and whenever we had a problem, I'd point to that student, and they would snap into action because it creates a habit of mind. So whether it's dictionary.com or any other digital source or a traditional dictionary. Creating the habit of mind is the most important thing. You get the extra benefits by using the actual dictionary because you could stop and visit some other words along the way. But regardless, building the habit of mind where if you don't know the definition of a word, not only is it ideal that you look it up, it's almost like required, it's almost mandated that you as a person who doesn't know something should desire to know it because it's literally that easy to get that information. And it's that laziness and that unwillingness to just go that extra little step that used to drive me crazy. And if I could teach my students anything in the classroom, it would be to go that extra step. How much time is it really going to take to look up that word? But you are creating a habit of mind that will last for your lifetime, and you will always go that extra step, and you will always want to look around that corner and look under that rock and learn that next thing. And I wanted them to be able to do that. So I always had the dictionary, I always had the word wall, whether it's dictionary.com or whatnot. We could split hairs and argue that all day long, but for me it was about building the good habits.
Oh, very inspirational. I'm going to have to go out and buy a dictionary now. And maybe I'll get an almanac while I'm at it.
Poor Richard's Almanac. All right. Well, thank you very much. This is a great conversation, and I'm glad we're finally able to get one in. I know we've had kind of a difficult period the last week and a half, 2 weeks, but we're on the other side of that now. If you would like to follow us on the web, you can find us at stateofedpodcast.com. If you have any questions or you'd like to suggest a topic, it's ask@stateofedpodcast.com. You can find us in the iTunes store, and please subscribe to us there. That's, of course, State of Ed Podcast, and we're in the podcast section of the iTunes store. If you want to tweet, you can find us at SOE Podcast. And that wraps up our show for the week. So try to stay cool, Nick, and crank up that AC, and I will talk to you next time.
Okay, take care.
Have a good one.